I'm Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. Clean up your damn room. Stand up straight with your shoulders back and listen to the Patrick Coffin Show.
Welcome to the show. Quick word from our affiliate friends at Covenant Eyes. CovenantEyes.com is the number one spot to go for porn blocker. And it's not just blocker, it's also accountability software. For 30 days, you can test drive this thing for free. It's on all of our devices here in Coffin Land. And the coupon code is Patrick, my first name, Patrick. So go to CovenantEyes.com, click the coupon at the checkout, Patrick, P-A-T-R-I-C-K, and you can test drive it for 30 days. It's a phenomenal tool. It's software. It's very easy to use. Even for practicing Luddites like me, it's pretty much adult-proof. So check it out. CovenantEyes.com. Coupon code Patrick gets you 30 free days. To our topic, let's dive in. In 1972, Pope, now St. Paul VI, made a comment in a general audience in November 1972. He referred to the smoke of Satan having made its way through some fissure into the temple of God, the house of God, namely the church. And those words have turned out to be depressingly prophetic, with the massive loss of faith in the Catholic world since the Second Vatican Council, the exodus of so many priests and religious from their vows, the rise of acceptable dissent from Humanae Vitae on down, just basic Catholic 101 things no longer being followed. 6 times more Catholics leave the church every year as enter. There's a massive crisis of evangelization and catechesis. But now, with the weaponized ambiguity of Pope Francis, things seem to be getting worse. What can we do? How can we turn this around? Well, the author of a book by that title, The Smoke of Satan, is here to unpack the true from the false and to explain what the average Catholic can do going forward, right here on The Patrick Coffin Show. Yes, indeed. Philip Lawler is our guest. He's the editor of Catholic World News and now the program director for the Center of the Restoration of Christian Culture at St. Thomas More College in Merrimack, New Hampshire. He's written many books. His latest is called The Smoke of Satan, How Corrupt and Cowardly Bishops Betrayed Christ, His Church, and the Faithful, and What Can Be Done About It. Phil, welcome back, sir. Always great to talk to you.
Thank you. It's good to join you.
It's depressing how many books of this topic you have to keep cranking out because things have to be called by the right name. So thanks for writing it. The previous book you spoke about on the show was Lost Shepherd, how Pope Francis is betraying the faithful. Is that the correct subtitle?
Misleading His Flock.
Misleading His Flock. Thank you. That's links better in with the shepherd metaphor. Why did you write this new book,
Well, it's
The Smoke of Satan?
interesting. I didn't want to write it, and the publisher didn't want to publish it.
And I didn't want to read it, so we're good.
Exactly. So there's a clean sweep. But we all felt that we had to. I felt that I have been preparing for 25 years, unintentionally, unwillingly, to write this book. And I thought the time was right. I think that right now we're at a time, a crucial moment, where Catholics are very angry, and rightfully so. Bishops are nervous, and rightfully so. They should be. And this may be a moment where people are finally ready to ask the questions that they should have been asking for the last 35, 40, 50 years. And so I was trying to accelerate that process a little bit, and I thought it was critical to get this book out before the bishops' meeting in November, which we managed to do.
You really cover the waterfront of very recent things. The Vigano letter, the letter wars, for lack of a better phrase, the McCarrick scandal, and of course, as you and I are talking now, Father Paul Sullins, PhD, retired sociologist from Catholic University of America, has published really almost a meta survey, somewhat correcting, but also completing and filling in the blanks of the John Jay report, linking, and this is one of the things I want to talk to you about, linking the crisis, which is not of pedophile priests, but rather homosexual predators in the priesthood. So it's very much an up-to-date presentation. Phil, I wanted to ask you about certain papacies get summarized in very pithy phrases. When you think of Pope John the 23rd, you think, open the doors or open the windows of the Second Vatican Council. John Paul II, be not afraid. Paul VI seems to be identified with the smoke of Satan comment that he made. To your knowledge, did he intend something specific by it? Was he looking around at the wreckage that was already in evidence? Because he
Yes,
certainly,
he was.
it came much more painfully true than he imagined, I think.
Yes, it was. I think he was, toward the end of his papacy, I think he was tortured by the recognition of the difficulties that were happening in the church, the confusion that was spreading. He saw the confusion, he lamented it, and he couldn't quite figure out how to get it under control. The smoke of Satan comment came in a talk on the 9th anniversary of his coronation. And he was speaking at a time when he saw the product of Vatican II blowing up. And it was specifically in context. He's talking about how the smoke of Satan has interfered with the implementation of Vatican II. So his whole argument was not that Vatican II, not that the teachings were wrong, but that the confusion that was spread through the smoke of Satan was preventing the implementation of the council's teaching and preventing the evangelization that the council intended.
It's an interesting metaphor for him to employ. If you think about the similarity between smoke and incense, there's a kind of suggestion that the smoke is a counterfeit incense, but it's a lie, and a very plausible lie. You know, smoke looks like incense; it almost smells like it, and yet it's not the real thing. I think it's a apropos image for him to use.
It is, and it's also, of course, it obscures things. And
right.
My argument is the smoke has never been cleared out. It's just been billowing through the walls or through the apse of the church for most of our lifetime.
For people over 25, by apse, you don't mean APPS, but APSE, right?
That's right, yeah.
No, the apse of the church. Okay, good. One of my favorite writers is Frank Sheed, and Christ in Eclipse is a very interesting book. You cite him here. I'll just say what he wrote, and you can comment on it. We are not baptized into the hierarchy, do not receive the cardinals sacramentally, will not spend eternity in the beatific vision of the Pope. Christ is the point. That distills so much of the problem. With true clericalism, I know that the homosexual predator scandal is given the euphemism clericalism, but clericalism does exist. There is a kind of papalatry. You can see this in some of the statements of people like Father Thomas Rosica, who essentially paints the Pope as some kind of anointed maverick who can dispense with things like sacred scripture and tradition.
That's for sure. And I think it's not just the Pope. I think I've been trying to make this argument for years, and I think, again, we've reached a point at which the argument is easier to make just because so many people recognize the problem now who haven't recognized it for years.
Yeah.
And my argument being that there are too many people, particularly in the hierarchy, who think of the church as the hierarchy, as the institution exclusively. And of course, the church is an institution, and it's easy to be facile here and go off rails by being facile. The church is an institution, but it isn't just an institution. And if you're not focused on Jesus Christ, then you've got a bad image of the church. And this is an argument I've been making for years, particularly with regard to the abuse scandal, because if you as a bishop think you are helping the church by protecting abusers and ignoring their victims, you have a very weird idea of what the church is.
The notion of as you point out in your book, you're talking about the habit of dishonesty that has been built up in the hierarchy through years of avoiding conflicts. How much of the problem we're now looking at is rooted in the way bishops are trained as Romanist diplomats, trained to smooth things over, have everything concerned with optics more than substance, wanting to avoid conflict? Maybe you see this in the Ostpolitik of Paul VI and his kind of rapprochement with the Soviet world, which had a mixed outcome. How much of this is the way, they even call it baby bishop school, a more infantilized phrase, it's hard to imagine. How much is of the way bishops are trained in Rome responsible for this kind of a systemic softness and refusal to call things by the right name?
I think it's a very big part of the problem, because it's not just the training of bishops, it's also the selection of bishops. The priests who are on the fast track to be chosen as bishops are those who have learned to play the game. They're those who've learned to project success in the middle of a disaster, to talk about the vibrant church at a time when people were hemorrhaging members and mass attendance is in free fall. To ignore the problems, because if you start talking too much about the problems, you look as if you're not, the positive, upward, forward types that are very successful fundraisers, among other things. So I think it's systemic, as you say, and this is a problem that can only be resolved by reminding bishops that they are first and foremost fathers. The notion of baby bishops, you're right, there's something wrong there. I know it's just a joke, but if there's something wrong, it's kind of just shouldn't make.
You wrote very bluntly and frankly in your book, two versions of which I've enjoyed, Faithful Departed. And when we look back at the long Lent of 2002 and the explosion in Boston and how that had ripple effects across the states and around the world, you'd think, I have this file in my head, Phil, it's got two words on the file tab, you'd think that the pain and the lessons that were supposed to be learned by our leaders at that point, including Cardinal Dole, this is, you cite the transcript from a 2003 PBS interview. He was responding to the question about whether bishops' vigilance regarding sexual misconduct might fade, and he said very vehemently, can't happen. We will never want to go through what we've had to. We just can't do it. We can't do it. Personally, I think we bishops will collapse if we ever have to go through this again. We just can't. We can't, in justice, put our people through that again. Fast forward to what came out with the Vigano letters and the fall of Uncle Ted, now still sitting archbishop. I know he's retired, but he's certainly not been laicized. I haven't heard a single word about a trial. It just seems like business as usual again.
Well, just let me point your attention to something about what Cardinal Dolan was saying then. Notice that he's setting himself up as the victim. The bishops are the victim. It was terrible for them. Well, yeah, I know it was terrible for them, but it was really very bad for the victims.
Yeah, not a picnic for the victims, yeah.
And it wasn't a picnic for us either, for the loyal Catholics who were just sitting on the sidelines watching their church pulled apart by this scandal. And the scandal was on the bishop's shoulders, so it's setting yourself up as the victim there is really inappropriate, but it's also really telling, because I think that's what happened in 2002 at Dallas, is the bishops set themselves up as the people who are going to fix this problem that had just sort of happened as if it fell out of the sky. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not how it occurred. It happened because they let it happen, because they were complicit in the scandal. And so yeah. It was entirely inappropriate for them to think that this was resolving their problem.
Were you galled to learn that the bishops exempted their own members from sanctions in the Dallas Charter? Or is there some canonical reason why they had to do that?
Well, I was there in Dallas when they were discussing that, and there is a canonical reason. Bishops don't have any authority over other bishops. Only the Pope can discipline bishops. So canonically, they couldn't do anything. But that doesn't mean they couldn't do anything at all.
Write an essay, give a speech,
yeah,
hold a press conference, call people out. Isn't this what men do with other men who are straying? I mean, this seems to me, when I read the Archbishop Vigano letters, a man I've never met, but I now admire from afar, I see someone who is, by all accounts, has a sterling reputation, by all the bishops who have dared to come out and say, look, what the issues that he is raising deserve full investigation, and the ones who are complaining are the same men who appear in his letter.
Exactly. Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. The bishops couldn't do anything canonically to discipline each other, but they could do fraternal correction, and they didn't. And not only that, let me go a step further, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know, Patrick, but in many cases, and the McCarrick case is front and center, they were not only tolerating this sort of misbehavior among their colleagues, they were promoting these people. Mm-hmm. And the Vigano letters are so important because they demonstrate that McCarrick and others have been promoted by what certainly looks like a homosexual lobby within the Bishops' Conference, and that lobby goes right all the way up to the Vatican.
Michael Rose wrote a book back in the 90s, I'm sure you remember, Goodbye, Good Men. And I remember that book being castigated by some even conservative Catholic circles as, overstating the problem, and it wasn't objectively verifiable sociological data. And admittedly, as Rose said, it was a lot of it was anecdotal, but anecdotal evidence is better than no evidence. Do you think that the problems of the so-called lavender mafia and homosexual or homosexualist bishops has gotten worse in the last 20 years?
Yes, I think it's gotten worse because I think it's entrenched. I think that in 2002, the bishops had an opportunity to deal with it, and they blundered that opportunity away. They took a mulligan on that. You remember in 2002 when Pope John Paul II invited all of the leaders of the American Bishops' Conference to Rome to discuss this crisis.
Yeah.
And when they came back, they were talking about it. I remember now Archbishop Gregory was talking about the need to make sure that there weren't homosexual subcultures in the seminaries. By the time they got to Dallas, that question had been stricken from the agenda. And once you've stricken that question from the agenda, you've more or less guaranteed that you're not going to get to the root of the problem.
Well, that's also a very clever way to put it. It doesn't say that there shouldn't be practicing or pro-homosexual individual bishops promoted to the episcopacy. Those are two separate questions.
Right. Yes. Well, yes, but to say you're not going to discuss the issue at all is to say you're not going to really grapple with this problem, which, by the way, is also my criticism of when Pope Francis said that he is calling together the leaders of all the Episcopal conferences from around the world to meet in Rome in February next year to talk about this, and specifically to talk about how to protect young children. Well, if that's all they're talking about, then once again, they're not talking about the elephant in the room.
Yeah, and I object to the use of the word children and child rapist and pedophile priest. It's another deflection and denial about what the heart of it is, as you point out in The Smoke of Satan. I want to ask you about Archbishop Jose Rodriguez Carballo, Secretary of the Congregation for Religious. You cite him in the book as saying that the religious communities worldwide are really, quote, really enjoying good health at this moment. But he'd already disclosed that each year about 3,000 consecrated religious drop out of their communities. How do those two fit?
They fit only if you've learned the sort of Roman capacity, the Roman propensity for dishonesty, which is the focus of this book. It's a special kind of dishonesty. It's not quite a lie, but it's a misleading statement. Yes, there are healthy religious communities. Yes, the sacraments are being administered. Yes, there are holy Catholics all around the world. On the supernatural plane, the church is always doing wonderful things. Mm-hmm. But if you look at it realistically, you see the women's religious communities of which he was speaking are in free fall, most of them, with exceptions. And by the way, it's very illustrative to notice which communities are flourishing. It's the traditional ones.
And why?
Yes, and why. But here we are in the middle of a situation where you have women's religious communities that are no longer Christ-centered and are proud of it, that are engaging in what I would refer to as pagan ceremonies more than Christian ceremonies, and not recognizing that we have a serious problem on our hand and covering it up, whitewashing it with the idea that there's a lot of vigor in the communities. Well, sure, there's vigor in the communities, but there's also a lot of health in people who have cancer.
That's good. Have you been given some flack and pushback and some nasty comments because of the books that you've written, Lost Shepherd particularly, and The Smoke of Satan? From the Orthodox wing of the church? Are people unhappy with you?
Some are. It's interesting. The pushback that I get comes in two forms. The main form is just being ignored. The preferred form for sort of the institutional church is to pretend I don't exist. I don't get comments from bishops. I don't get negative reviews in diocesan publications and so forth. I'm ignored. There are some conservative Orthodox Catholics who are unhappy with me because I criticize the Pope, and they think you should never criticize the Pope. And I can understand that. I think it's, in this case, a misplaced loyalty, but I admire the loyalty. I can deal with that.
I was slowly red-pilled going forward. For about 2 years, I did my best to Pope-splain. I would sort of try to domesticate what he was trying to get at, and I imagined in my mind a 3-volume set that I would write one day. Volume 1, what Pope Francis was alleged to have said. Volume 2, what Pope Francis actually said in context. And then Volume 3, which was would be 5,000 pages long, what Pope Francis may have been thinking about when he said what he said in context. And at some point, I just stopped doing it. And I just said to myself, I'm not responsible for what he says and does. And some of the things, especially in the last year or two, have been disturbing. You mention a couple of them in your book, Smoke of Satan, Phil. And one is, you could say it goes to optics. I'm not crazy about that phrase either, sort of made famous by President Obama. But the people you choose to include in the frame of your depiction, I think says a lot about your priorities. And one of the examples you give is the Archbishop from Guam, Anthony Apuran, who'd been a friend of the neo-catechumenal way. On May 5th, 2018, he was on the dais next to the pontiff. Now, was he not involved in a canonical trial for sexual abuse himself?
He had already been convicted.
Already convicted, but he was appealing it and said he was innocent.
Right. So he's not technically guilty until he's exhausted his appeals. But that doesn't mean you have to put him on the stage beside the Pope.
How about in March 2013, where to the Pope's the Holy Father's left shoulder is none other than retired Cardinal Gottfried Daniels, who oversaw the slow destruction of the church in Belgium for 30 years, who himself was embroiled in controversies and his own doctrinal dissent. That was a disturbing
That
image.
was. And again, there's a cardinal who's on videotape. I'm not sure it's videotape. It might be audio tape, advising a sex abuse victim to keep quiet, not to rock the boat.
Yeah, the victim was the nephew of another archbishop, right?
That's right. Yeah. And so again, and there it's not just optics. Pope Francis has promoted Cardinal Daniels, who is retired. So there's nothing wrong with just letting him live out his retirement.
Yeah, he can't vote.
But to bring him in as a synod delegate and to bring him in as a counselor to the Holy See, it seems entirely inappropriate.
I'll give you one more because this could be a long list. The rainbow design 70s era cross that the Holy Father wore during the Youth Synod, in addition to his silver pectoral cross. Now, give me a break. I had to laugh at defenders saying, well, in context here, see, in South America, there's a rainbow design for some catechetical institute. Well, yeah, but the world over, the rainbow now has been completely co-opted by the LGBT agenda, and it's at least weaponized ambiguity to don that as the Pope.
Exactly. And I'm frankly not buying the idea that this is some Latin American symbol that I hadn't caught up with yet. Maybe it is, but calling me suspicious at this time. I've heard too many of these stories, and I can no longer credit them all.
Well, it's like saying an image of red and white stripes with stars in Upper Bessarabia refers to the history of plumbing or something. Yeah, right. Nice try. This really got my attention in your book, Phil. I'll just cite from it now. The book "Smoke of Satan." Pope Pius XI once called in a prominent American Jesuit diplomat to brief him on the anti-Catholic persecutions of the day, the atheistic Soviet regime that was sending Russian believers to the gulags, the Mexican government that was hunting down priests and executing them, the anti-clerical campaign in Spain that would produce such pathological hatred during that country's civil war. So the Pope listened to the priest's report and then posed a rhetorical question. Tell me, Father Walsh, who have been the worst persecutors of the church? Jesuit pauses and says the church's worst persecutors have been her own unfaithful bishops, priests, and religious. Opposition from the outside is terrible. It gives many martyrs, but the church's worst enemies are her own traitors. another saying from the past that has proven to be prophetic for the future.
That's right. We have internal problems, but you can't fight a two-front war. And we, as Catholics, as Christians, are right now we're engaged in a battle. We always are. We're this supernatural battle at all times.
Yeah.
The spiritual warfare is now combined with a sort of social warfare. The sexual revolution and its aftermath and so forth. We can fight that, but it's awfully tough to fight a two-front war. And when you're fighting the fight in your parish, in your diocese, it's just asking too much. And this is one of the things that I wanted to get across in my book, is that the problem is not just a problem that we've had since Pope Francis ascended to the throne of Peter. It's a problem that we've had, again, all of our lifetime. The decline in mass attendance, the chaos in Catholic schools, the experience in a typical Catholic parish. We've been in battle, and it's a battle that's very hard to sustain when you don't have the support that you need from the people who should be your leaders.
Why don't you go along with the more radical traditionalist brethren and cast aspersions on the council itself? Since people like you cite the work of is it Kevin Jones, the index of decline of the church since 1962 has been devastating. You can sort of see the Second Vatican Council as a kind of fulcrum or inciting incident that led to a lot of chaos, a lot of doctrinal problems, the new Mass of Paul VI. Mm-hmm. So why be so rah-rah Vatican II?
I'm not rah-rah Vatican II, and as time goes on, I'm less and less enthusiastic. Mm-hmm. I see problems with the council. I don't see the council as the problem. I think that most of our lives as Catholics, we've been faced with this sort of choice between saying, oh, Vatican II was wonderful, everything about it was fantastic, it's just been misinterpreted, mm-hmm. or saying it's terrible, it's the source of all evil, it's the root of the problems in the church today. And I think both of those choices are wrong. I think that Vatican II had some wonderful teachings for the faith and some very timely instructions for the faithful. It also contained within the documents themselves some time bombs that have been exploited by people whose intentions are not friendly to the Catholic faith.
Time bombs because of ambiguous verbal formulations?
That's right. Now, perhaps intentionally. When you have that large a product of documents, yeah. It's very hard to keep out the little phrases that somebody puts in there as a time bomb.
It's also
go ahead.
Question
in my mind that the liturgical reform that actually happened was not the liturgical reform that the fathers of the council intended. That was hijacked.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's no indication in Sacrosanctum Concilium, the dogmatic constitution on the liturgy, that called for some radical tinkering and the destruction of Latin. Rather, the contrary. If you read the letter of Vatican II, it doesn't resemble the spirit of Vatican II at all. And then right. Paul VI, seemingly on his own initiative in 1969, installed the Novus Ordo Missae, the new Mass, which is not directly attributable to the Second Vatican Council. It's almost a standalone move, as is the positioning of the celebrant facing the congregation. Right. I'm very friendly with the FSSP, and I love the Latin Mass. I like my pilot facing the same way that I'm going. So to people who say, well, the priest has his back to the people, that's a misnomer. But that's another thing that can't be attributed to the Second Vatican Council. Communion in the hand was voted down by 80% at the council.
Right. And communion in the hand, by the way, is one of those things, and altar girls.
That's right.
Where it began as a violation of norms and
Bingo.
Was gradually regularized.
Yeah, and so the church, maybe as an indulgent mother, accommodated the dissent of her children.
Right, which is a mistake.
You remember the 1994? It really took me by surprise when all of a sudden the church decided from the Roman pontiff down to kind of destroy the farm team of the majors in a some way. Does that analogy make sense?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does, because
Yeah.
it also drives a lot of boys out of the pool for being altar boys, which helps to drive them out of the pool for being priests. So that was really too bad.
What about the precedent that it sets for other dissenters who want to agitate for change, knowing now that we've got precedent? I mean, I'm a father. Your family, you've got more children than I do. Kids notice when other kids are disciplined poorly or well. It becomes an object lesson for everybody when you lay down the law properly. Which leads me to a question. I don't know if you've ever pondered this, Phil. Do you think that an argument could be made in favor of John Paul II retiring early because of his slow declining health and his increasing weakness? I know it's a big what if, but I'm thinking I wasn't crazy about the abdication of Pope Benedict. I'm still not, frankly. It doesn't settle well in my spirit. I take his reasons at face value. But if John Paul II had retired, and I understand there's some evidence that he pondered abdicating, a lot of bad things happened in those last 10 years when he was obviously physically weak, and it was heartbreaking to watch him, but inspiring in a different way.
Right. I think that there are definitely what-if arguments to be made, both for John Paul II and Benedict XVI. And one of the arguments, one of the what-ifs in my mind is, if John Paul had retired, would Benedict have retired? Because I think part of what went into his resignation was seeing what had happened at the end of the previous pontificate, when John Paul II really couldn't do what he had set out to do, and Benedict was right there, seeing the bad things happening, and saying, "I'm not going to let that happen again as I, go into my own old age and weakness and so forth." Like you, I wish he hadn't resigned, but I think there probably is an argument to be made that John Paul could have, and it would have been better for the church. I don't know.
Well, Pope Benedict did disclose that he really didn't want the gig. The fact that he wrote these 3 massive tomes, the Jesus of Nazareth books, when he could have been writing authentic or authoritative, dogmatic statements, especially in the liturgy. That to me, that epitomizes my admiration for him. I actually got to meet him in 2012. I introduced him to my father, who just passed away in April. Met Benedict in Rome and had a much longer conversation than I thought. So I loved him. His book, Introduction to Christianity, really helped me come back to the church. But I think you're right. He didn't want to repeat the almost incapacitated leadership of John Paul II.
Right.
One phrase that you use in the book, Smoke of Satan, Phil, caught my attention. You say, we must address the internal problems of the church before we can solve the troubles of society. We must revive the cult to repair the culture. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's one of my pet peeves that when asked, why is mass attendance declining, priests and bishops and theologians will say, oh, it's the culture. The culture is unfriendly to Christianity. To which I say, okay, you haven't answered the question. You've just kicked the can down the road a little bit. Why is the culture unfriendly to Christianity? What happened to the culture? Because isn't the faith about forming the culture? The word itself expresses culture comes from the cult, from your beliefs, your fundamental beliefs. So the faith should inform the culture. Why are we in a situation where the water is running in the other direction, where the culture informs the faith rather than the faith informing the culture?
And does that boil down to the leaders are happy that that's the direction of the water? Because there's no self-sacrifice, there's no cross, there's no burden, there's no challenge, there's no death to self. It's just all groovy, man.
There's that. There's the everything is beautiful approach. But there's also, I think, the cult, of course, refers to the liturgy for us, the Eucharistic liturgy, fundamentally. And that has to be nurturing people. It has to be taking people out of their everyday lives. And when people go to Sunday Mass and it looks sort of like a civic meeting, That's not providing, that's not changing the culture. That's not the cult that has the impact we need.
Or a civil meeting where the meeting attendees are almost literally worshiping themselves, especially through the music.
Oh, don't get me started on the music.
You cite one of my favorite books by Thomas Day, Why Catholics Can't Sing. Now, there's a guy who I think is sort of, in some ways, a man of the soft left, but certainly liturgically, his instincts are brilliant. He's some very funny anecdotes and wisdom there.
Right. Yeah. Well, just this weekend, I went to a concert, and I was of Catholic musical groups, Catholic choirs, and I have to say, it was stunning how much bad music, badly performed there was. Why do we accept this? Why do we accept this in our churches?
Yeah, it's hard to. I did a whole show, and I'll probably visit again with Monsignor George Rutler and also Anthony Esselin, your friend there just so I get the name right. Yes, but the Restoration Center.
Center for the Restoration of Christian Culture.
Yes, fantastic. Well, there it is again. There's the cult built into the word culture. When I was being trained by fairly left-wing professors in my undergrad in theology, the special ire was often directed at Pope St. Pius X for his treatment of the modernist crisis. And Pascendi Dominici Gregis in 1907 was seen as the sort of the closed-minded Magna Carta, which drove the truth-tellers underground, and it kind of resurfaced decades later. When I read the description of modernism by Pius X, I find it to be very accurate and prophetic, that it's the synthesis of all heresies. It's like an idea virus that resembles the real thing, but unlike past heresies, it's hard to root out and draw bright lines. It's like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. Does that make sense?
Exactly. It is. It's very difficult, and typically, when someone is disciplined by the Vatican, of course that doesn't happen anymore, but in the past, when a theologian would be disciplined by the Vatican, or the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith would issue a warning, the response from the theologian would be, well, but that's not what I said. It's hard. The Council of Trent could define propositions and anathematize them.
Yeah.
It's hard to do that with modernism because everything is so malleable and changeable. Yeah. There's no there.
Yeah, the Quicksilver heresy.
Right. Yeah. The anonymous Christian and all that sort of thing it's very difficult to define and condemn. So it's very hard to grapple with.
Another person in the inner circle of the Holy Father is Cardinal Oscar Maradiaga of Honduras. He said the Second Vatican Council had been convened to end, quote, end the hostilities between the Church and modernism, which was condemned in the First Vatican Council. And then he adds, modernism was, most of the time, a reaction against injustices and abuses that disparaged the dignity and the rights of the person. I wonder, I like these thought experiments. If Pope St. Pius X could come back and be in the same room with Cardinal Maradiaga, how would that conversation go? Because it seems to be inverted opposites.
Yes, and here's one of the things that I cite when people criticize me for criticizing Pope Francis. If you really have a fealty to the papal office, then you have to respect the teachings of the popes, plural. That is, all of the popes. And if one pope is contradicting another, well, then you have to make a decision. You can't say, I accept whatever is said by this week's pope, which might be contradicted by the pope next week. You have to look at the whole continuity of the teaching tradition. Now, with Cardinal Maradiaga, what he's saying is essentially that Vatican II was wrong in condemning modernism. I mean, isn't that...
Yeah, Vatican I. Vatican I, you mean?
Yeah, Vatican I.
Yeah.
It's really the only logical inference from what he's saying. Well, if Vatican I could be wrong, then Vatican II could be wrong, and Cardinal Maradiaga could be wrong today. So where do you look for any sort of authentic and reliable teaching?
Do you think it's a good idea for Pope Francis to resign? forget the merits and demerits of his papacy. He's hinted a couple of times in public that he has pondered abdicating. What are your thoughts on that possibility?
I hope he doesn't. For one thing, one retired pope is plenty at a time. To have two, one of them with a proven habit of speaking out of turn, would be disastrous. Second, I don't approve of popes resigning as a rule. I was disheartened when Pope Benedict did. I assumed at the time he was deathly ill, and that was the reason.
Yeah.
Had I known that he was not all that sick, I would have been even more disheartened. But last and most important, I don't want Pope Francis to resign. I want him to reform. I want him to change what he's doing. I want him to fulfill the promise that I saw, and I guess you saw, at the beginning of his papacy, and to actually be an effective reformer. I haven't given up hope. I'm praying for that.
Well, that's great. And unlike me, you co-wrote a book about Pope Francis in the first year. So there was a kind of a freshness. Oh, interesting. A Jesuit who's probably a practicing Catholic, because now he's the Pope, and how kind of energizing that was. It all sort of slowly changed. Also, Phil, go ahead.
It wasn't just an impression. It wasn't just optics, as you say. It was real. I mean, I found people in my neighborhood who wanted to talk about the Catholic faith at the beginning of this pontificate who had never had that interest before. Mm-hmm. People were talking about the faith, and that's a good thing. He had opened some minds and some eyes, and that's great. I'd like to see more of that.
It does seem that he's happy to wade into waters of controversy, and it's almost like, remember Yosemite Sam just opening fire, Yosemite Sam with the white yarmulke. But on things like, migration of migrants and the environment and climate change and all manner of leftist ideas and political theories that have no inherent connection, or at least they're not tied definitively to Catholic doctrine. And yet on things to do with Catholic 101, he's silent, including the great silence that he expressed in the aircraft flight from Dublin back to Rome about the Vigano letter accusations. I will not say one word.
Right, and the Dubia, of course, which
and
this
extension. It's like the Dubia sequel, right?
It is, and the Dubia. He has not convened the College of Cardinals since the time of the Dubia, because if there is a meeting of the College of Cardinals, he will be asked to answer the Dubia. So he's foregoing the counsel of his chosen advisors rather than answer the question that is a legitimate question, simple yes or no questions that everybody wants to hear the answer to.
How many times has the Pope gone to South America in the last 6 years? I want to say 3, but it's possibly 2. Rio for World Youth Day, and then Chile, of course. That was an absolute disaster. I'm thinking maybe there was a third. I find it odd and striking that he never returned to his country of origin. John Paul II was one of his first trips to Poland. Pope Benedict went to Germany. Paul VI was from Italy, so that's as was his predecessor. Do you find it odd that he's never gone back to his native land? Very odd.
Very odd. That's one of several mysteries to me. Why he doesn't want to go back to Argentina. It wouldn't have been that much difficult. There wouldn't have been that much difficulty in adding Argentina to one of the trips he's already made to neighboring countries there. It's odd. I just can't figure it out. That his relationship with the Jesuits is another mystery to me. He was not popular with the Jesuits before he was Pope. Now he's tremendously so, and he surrounded himself with Jesuit advisors. I wonder what's going on there.
Well, I read or interviewed, I forget, I'm conflating my sources here, that he's never visited the Jesuit Church. He's never officially showed up at the headquarters as Pope.
That's interesting. Yeah. I know that before he became Pope, when he traveled to Rome, which he did infrequently, he would not meet with Jesuits, which you would expect a Jesuit prelate to do.
I'm going to resist the temptation to launch into a Jesuit joke, and there's nothing you can do to stop me from not doing that. I want to end on some hope here, Phil, because you tell a beautiful anecdote that I and probably a lot of my listeners and viewers can relate to, and that is, I too remember the first time I walked through the holy doors. It was 1997 in Rome, my first time inside St. Peter's, and I remember consciously feeling that it was like reverse deja vu. I have never felt anything like this before. The jaw-dropping beauty, the sheer scale of the place. And as you point out near the end of the book, you say you were overwhelmed by two feelings. Number one, how beautiful and just how awesome it is. And then secondly, it's mine. This is the best of the best of my holy Catholic faith. And it's sort of pride in the redeemed sense.
Right. And I think that this is what's motivating a whole lot of Catholics, loyal Catholics right now, particularly in the United States, which is right now ground zero for this whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a sense, this is mine, this is my heritage. People ask, if you're so unhappy with the church, why don't you leave? Well, I'm not leaving, it's mine. It's my church. I'm not leaving, I'm going to stay and fight.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a whole lot of people who I know feel the same way. We're going to stay and fight. And Archbishop Fulton Sheen said it's the lay people who are going to save the church. It's not the bishops. It's the lay people who are going to say, you will not deny me. You will not deny my children our patrimony.
What can the average lay person do? I know thoughts and prayers. Everything is, of course we have to pray. And my own prayer life has certainly gotten more intentional as things have gotten crazy externally. I think there's like a built-in invitation to grow in what exactly the Catholic faith is and why it transcends this or any papacy. Going to the Catholic thing. It's very important to return to the sources and, finish the sentence with confidence. I'm Catholic because. Do you recommend writing attaboys and letters of affirmation to bishops? Shoring up what is good. No one likes letter writing campaigns. When I see letter writing campaigns, these boycotts against people like Cardinal Supich, I have to laugh because who's going to read that letter again? Who's going to be presented with this list? It's self-defeating. So any practical tips on what lay folk can do?
Well, as you say, first of all, prayer and specific prayer. Pray for your pastor, pray for your bishop, pray before you talk to them, pray a lot before you talk to them, but then talk to them. And talk to your pastor. If you can't talk to your bishop, talk to your pastor. Don't nag. Don't always be negative. Encourage good things, discourage bad things. Do not write checks to organizations that do not support the faith. Target your contributions to the good things. Make sacrifices to support the good things. But above all, I tell people, demand the truth. Demand the truth first of yourself, then of your pastor, then of your bishop, and for that matter, of the Pope. Demand that they give you the honest truth of the faith, the authentic teachings of the faith, and an honest assessment of where we are in the church and what our problems are. And don't be satisfied when you know you're getting a pat answer, the brush-off public relations answer. Don't buy it. Don't even pretend you buy it. Demand the truth.
How about strengthening the family in a more kind of salient way, especially marriages? Because that's a walking homily, is a happy marriage and a strong family.
Absolutely. And it's also, I think, the best way of everyday evangelization. If you have a happy family life and if you're living the faith in its fullness, celebrating holy days, feast days, having special family traditions on different days of liturgical year, people love that. People want to be part of it. You invite people to celebrate Corpus Christi with you, a special meal or something like that.
Yeah.
People remember, and then they'll do it themselves. And I think that's the way the church originally started to grow.
Yeah, something off of Easter Christmas, right? Like Corpus Christi. The joke about the Easter Christmas Catholic who is complaining to the pastor that every time he goes to church, it's just lilies and poinsettias. Can we have some variety?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. If you ask folks who've been away from the church for a long time, what took them so long to come back, the answer is often, nobody invited me.
There's that. It doesn't have to be a church event. It could be an event in your home, where
sure.
maybe you sing some hymns, or maybe you have a feast, but somehow it's related to the culture, which stems from the cult again.
Right. The church domestic.
And everybody loves it. It's attractive. The faith sells. It's not the product. It's the salesman.
Yeah, right. And I believe it was Frank Sheet who said, we're meant to judge a medicine by people who take it, not by people who neglect it.
Right.
And that was the saints who took it.
Right.
The book is called The Smoke of Satan. Its author, our guest today, Philip Lawler. Thank you so much, Phil.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Before we sign off, I just want to mention you might have been looking lovingly, maybe covetously, at this manly etched mug. This is delicious, Tim Hortons coffee. You get this mug as part of a membership at Coffin Nation. Go to coffinnation.com. Join the online community of culture builders. It's 3 levels of engagement. We have a blast. We have people from 4 different countries. We're growing every time we open the doors. Registration ends November 26th. Okay, November 26th, 2018. It will not reopen again until the summer of 2019. So sign up, coffinnation.com, and I look forward to seeing you on the inside. Phil, thanks again. Appreciate the book and your time, sir.
Thank you.
This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there? Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.